Tarisland is a brand new MMO that was released on both PC and mobile. It was really only created because for a short period of time, World of Warcraft was actually banned in China. So the developers Tencent saw this as an opportunity to create a WoW clone and capitalize on many of the players who had just lost their favorite game. Now, I'll be honest, there's a ton of things about Tarisland that probably won't inspire much confidence. The fact that the game was released on both PC and mobile, the fact that the game feels and looks like a World of Warcraft that was made in China, the fact it implements a bunch of mobile game Eastern MMO gimmicks from auto-run to a ridiculously over-the-top cosmetics store. But let me tell you, after playing this game for just a short while, there is so much more than meets the eye when it comes to Tarisland. I'll be honest, I'm not sure if I've actually enjoyed another release quite as much since Season of Discovery. And today, I'm going to take you guys through that journey and explain why. But before we get into that, I would just like to quickly mention that I'm under the weather. If my voice sounds a little off in this video, that's why. But also, channel memberships are active, and if you've been a fan of MMOs and you've been enjoying my content, that's the best way to support me. Otherwise, join the Discord, follow me on Twitter, and definitely like the video. Thanks, now let's get back to it. So, starting off on day one, and I mean this, I knew nothing about this game. I had hardly heard any news, seen any clips. Normally, I'm pretty on top of my MMO research. But for some reason, Tarisland just slid completely under my radar. Thus, the limited knowledge that I did have included the fact that it's also a mobile game, that it's meant to be a bit of a WoW clone, but with that in mind, I, like I'm assuming many other players, did not have very high expectations. The game begins with some really well done cinematics. I'm already enjoying the art style. It's like a slightly more cartoony WoW, but it looks really clean. You're then introduced to the 9 gender-locked classes. My opinion on gender locking is that it's almost always a negative, and that more customization in terms of making your character yours is always a good thing. With that being said, I understand the reasoning behind gender locking in Tarisland. They wanted to get this game out quick in order to capitalize on the timing of release, and creating an entirely different model for every piece of gear and equipment, that can take an entirely long time. With that being said, Tarisland operates on a holy trinity system, where you have tanks, healers, and DPS. There are standard classes like warriors and paladins, as well as priest, but we also see some unique ones, like phantom necro and barbarian fighter. I spent a fair amount of time looking through all of the different classes and reading their descriptions, but ultimately decided that in a game like this, I think melee DPS would be the most fun to play. Every one of the classes seems like they bring a unique and fun playstyle, but man, ever since I played my Char in Guild Wars 2, I just can't seem to get away from badass furry things, okay? But in all honesty, the barbarian fighter that I chose is basically a jacked lion, okay? It's absolutely majestic, and if need be, it can also be a tank in a pinch. Furthermore, into the customization, you can pick between a few different hairstyles, adjust things like scars and tattoos, as well as skin, or in this case, fur color. So afterwards, the game places you into the tutorial. WASD to move, you've got a singular action bar at the bottom of the screen, though you eventually get another one. You have a quest tracker on the right side and apparently a DPS meter. That's kind of cool to see built directly into the game. Oh, and also during the tutorial, you start at level 18 so that you can get used to some of your class's abilities before you actually unlock them. Almost immediately, the combat feels super quick and reactive. There's clear indicators on the ground showing what the enemy is doing and what I need to avoid. There are a lot of people who will tell you that one of the things World of Warcraft always did right was the combat. And generally what they mean by that is the fluidity of it and how reactive it is. Just from a very, very first impression with Tarisland, I was actually getting a similar feeling. Now, when I say this is hands down one of the best in-game tutorials that I've ever experienced in an MMO, I'm not lying. You basically start with the very basics of combat, and the game gives you a few more and more difficult enemies while teaching you each one of your abilities along the way. Once you've learned all of your abilities, the game actually puts you into a mock-up 10-man raid with NPCs from the game. Not only showing you what you can expect from potentially endgame content, but also introducing you to the raid frames, and then it puts you up against an entire raid boss with actual mechanics that have to be avoided. It teaches you your role within the raid and what you should do as a group. I don't know why more games haven't done a tutorial exactly like this. giving you a taste of endgame and teaching you what it's all about as a sort of hook that really makes you want to continue leveling and getting to that point in the game. I thought this was excellently done, and even at this point, my first early impressions of what I thought Tarisland was going to be was slowly going out the window. After defeating the dragon, you're introduced to the inscribed stone, which is an integral part of your character and his story, before finally waking up as a level 1, ready to take on the world. Now, this game is chock full of cutscenes. They are completely skippable, but they're also really well done. I'd love to admit that I watched and listened to every single one, but I really didn't. But for any lore fanatics out there, there's definitely an entertaining story and plot to follow along with. I don't think it's Final Fantasy XIV levels of intricate storytelling, but it's definitely not the worst either. At this point, I decided to explore a bit more of the interface. Taking a look at my inventory, you have slots and more slots for bags, which will increase your slots. I hope that made sense. Then there's the quest journal, which is easy to track and understand, and eventually the world map. All in all, the game's user interface kind of felt like a simplified BDO user interface, with certainly a lot less menus. I followed Jaya through a cave and was brought to Ancash Canyon, the first sort of zone that you level in. And this absolutely theatrical shot of the place was pretty awesome. It reminded me of your first steps outside of the temple in Breath of the Wild, and I was excited to start exploring. Now, the game always leaves a glowing trail directly to your quest marker. Later on, as you gain reputation in certain zones, you'll actually unlock an auto-run feature in that zone that allows you to just directly run where you're needed to be. However, you do have to unlock that feature in each zone first, which is kind of a nice middle ground on that sort of system. However, truly, auto-run is something I don't usually love. I helped fend off some enemies along the road, and by turning in that quest, I already got to level 2. Leveling is fast. Like, very, very fast in Tarisland. You'll see as the video progresses, and I'll have more to say on that later, but just bear in mind that you're gonna fly through the leveling process. The max level I think currently is 40, with, I'm sure, plans in the future to increase that, but like I said, we'll get into more on that later. I made my way to Ancash Village to continue questing, and I met Defecate. I told them that they had a nice name, but they never replied. Which makes sense because with a name like that, you can only assume that they are probably AFK. Anyway, into Ancash Village is where I really got to see quite a few other players. The story quests are mostly instanced, but there are plenty of open world quests to participate in as well. Though you won't really need to do many open world quests for leveling. There's still other bonuses and rewards for doing them, but they're not essential. Here, I found my first Continental Codex. These are basically lore inscriptions and collectibles throughout each of the zones that will give you reputation and lead towards exploration achievements. Each of those achievements will have their own rewards from titles to money and even sometimes cosmetics. I was then told to fight some wolves, as well as this wolf boss. This area was completely packed as it was only day 2 after the game had actually released, so tons of new players were still in the starter areas. After beating Silvertooth, I was given my first piece of gear as an award. If you get a piece of gear that's an upgrade, a quick equip option will actually show up in the bottom right of the screen. However, after taking a look, it appears that gear does not actually change your appearance. Unfortunately, this is a major L from me. I personally love seeing my character become stronger and stronger through gear progression. And in Tarisland, all of the gear that visually changes your appearance is done through cosmetic items. It's super lame, but it is what it is. A few moments later, and I was already level 4. Just to put that in perspective, I've probably only been playing for about 15 minutes at this point. I continued through the story quest line. I fended off a giant gnoll and took some purple griffins around a giant dark mark floating in the sky before being introduced to the skill screen. Here, you're gonna find your 2 different specs, your actual skills, and even a talent tree. It doesn't get into all of it right away, but it does show me how I can upgrade my skills by using silver coins every level. And really, that's been one of the main positives about the game so far for me. Tarisland does such a perfect job at giving you bite-sized pieces of information and things to work with in a step-by-step manner. In a sense, I was still very much so in the tutorial. Learning about each of the new systems, never at one point did I feel overwhelmed or like it was too much. Even now, I was being directed into the Dim Cavern, which is basically your first mock dungeon that you will participate in with NPCs. Which is how they introduce you to every new dungeon in the game. It's really ingenious. Essentially, you do it on a story mode with NPCs for a quest, and then afterwards the game will prompt you to do each dungeon on different difficulty levels with real players. Starting from normal mode, going to elite, then potentially epic or challenge mode as well. Each mode has different mechanics, higher scaling, and is actually significantly more difficult. But we'll get into more on that later. The current dungeon ended with an awesome boss fight against Decorus, who has multiple stages, AoE attacks, don't stand in stupid mechanics, and so far I was just thoroughly impressed with all of the PvE that was being presented to me in otherwise a very short introduction to the game. After beating the spider, I opened this heavenly looking chest to get a nice new weapon. Awesome. I upgraded my skills, and at this point I was already level 7. Also, I got myself my first title, which I could actually equip, and as you can see there are plenty of titles, each with their own directions on how to obtain them. I am now Waydot, Savior of the Tata tribe. Afterwards, I was directed to the Reputation Shop, which is a shop that allows you to buy better and better items in certain areas depending on the reputation that you have with that faction. In here, I was able to buy my first mount, the Rhino. But while I was here, I got introduced to the rest of the shop items in the game. While it definitely looks like a sort of pay-to-win mobile game store, there's actually very little on here that can be bought with real-life currency. Technically, there are certain things that can be bought in a roundabout manner, but it's pretty unnecessary, at least so far with what I have experienced in the game. There's a dungeon shop, which uses currency you get from completing dungeons. There's the gold coin currency, which also seems to be obtainable in-game. But then there's this sort of blue crystal, and that seems to be the genuine microtransactional currency. But you can mostly just buy services with these, like renames, repet names, transfers, etc. All in all, given this game's country of origin being developed by Tencent and the fact that it's also a mobile game, I was really surprised with the in-game shop being significantly less pay-to-win than I expected. Who knows, I could very well be eating these words in a few months' time by seeing if they stick to this sort of integrity, or if in the very end game some systems pop up that are undoubtedly pay-to-win. None of that would really surprise me, but so far it seems okay for now. Anyway, as many of you know, I absolutely love getting a mount to ride on, especially early in-game. Mounts in Tarisland come with skills that you can use, and they can actually participate in combat as well. But it was actually pretty funny in the introduction to the game, as literally every single player only had this Rhino mount. So for a brief period of time, this was the only mount you saw. After all that was said and done, I was directed to a new area, and really a new city, Silverlit. I traveled there by boat in the beginning of the cutscene, but then afterwards by a boat helicopter. Silverlit is a giant sort of marbled, angelic feeling city located high in the mountains. So far, aesthetically wise, Tarisland was absolutely killing it. So I was excited to continue questing in this new area. Then I took a short break, had some lunch, and came back. I did some story quests and was directed to the intro at the Library of Chaos dungeon. I had only been playing for about 15 minutes since returning, and at this point I was already level 11. Then a short while later, I was level 13. The game directed me to use the in-game dungeon finder to queue up for the actual Library of Chaos dungeon with other players. And the queue ended up popping almost immediately, which was awesome. Now, one thing to note, which I didn't realize at the time, is the game will actually fill certain positions with bots. For example, the tank of my group here, Mario, is almost certainly not a real player. At the time I kinda thought he was, but no. To be honest, I'm not really sure when or when not the game decides to fill positions with bots, because sometimes I would queue for something that I thought would be pretty low populated, but I would get a group of real players, and then other times, not so much. Now, to be fair, any of the actual challenging content in the game you cannot fill with bots. For example, any of the challenge modes of dungeons or any of the raids. But to be honest, the bots are actually decent. They don't play quite as well as real players who actually know what they're doing, but given the fact that 99% of the time you queue up for a dungeon, the healer doesn't even know that they're supposed to heal, sometimes just getting the bot healer isn't such a bad trade-off. Either way, the dungeon was a ton of fun. Generally, each dungeon will have 3 separate bosses with a couple of trash mobs in between. There's an in-game guide button that will actually tell you the mechanics of each boss, so there's really no excuse to not understanding how to do a boss. Though I found that a lot of the mechanics are actually quite fun to deal with and mostly self-explanatory. though later on they can become drastically more difficult. No two bosses that I faced in the entire game were actually that similar. Every boss that I faced on my journey to 40, including smaller dungeon bosses and raid bosses, actually have quite a varied and fun array of mechanics to deal with. I can already tell this is definitely Tarisland's strong point, the PvE. After you down the last boss, you're given a sort of score sheet that compares how much damage or healing you did to the other players in your group. It shows your runtime and other stats, and you also get some loot and experience for finishing the dungeon. And at this point, I really just delved into the story and continued questing as fast as I could. The one thing I noticed is that due to the leveling process being so quick, the story also feels a little too quick at times. The game's pacing is so insanely fast, it just sort of feels like you go from saving the entire world to saving the entire world again to doing it a third time, almost all in one day. Obviously, that's a little nitpicky, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm not much of a lorehead myself, but this was just something I noticed. But still, so far, every cutscene was absolutely well done through both animation and voice acting, and seriously, if you took every cutscene and put them together, you could basically watch a mini movie. At this point, I was level 16, and the game told me that in order to continue on with the story quest, I had to reach level 20. Now, because this was the second day already, the max level currently in the game was actually 28. Let me explain. Basically, Tarisland has done a phased release with their content. So every day there's a new max level and a new max point in the story that you can get to. Day 1, you could get to level 20, day 2, 26, day 3, 30, then 34, 38, and finally 40. It was something like that, I'm actually not too sure. A lot of people actually didn't like this decision. They thought it was artificially time-gated and weird. But in my opinion, it was a sort of similar strategy to Season of Discovery from WoW. It basically allows casual players and hardcore players to not really get too far ahead of one another and disallow friend groups from potentially playing together. I honestly think a lot of games could learn from a release like this, although there is something to be said for having a ton of fun just grinding something out for the first few days of release and competing for those world firsts or leaderboard positions. Either way, I had to get to level 20, and in order to do so, I was going to run some more dungeons. So this is when I participated in my first elite dungeon. Library of Chaos again. Now, I'm not saying I carried this team, but I was topping the DPS meter most of the encounters, okay? We actually wiped a couple times on the end boss. I'm telling you, this game doesn't have super easy PvE. Even at just level 20, if a couple people make some mistakes, it's GG's. But eventually, we got it down. Anyways, afterwards, I was level 19. And I still needed to push for level 20. But I decided to take a look into the profession and crafting system, as there were some quests involving those and I wanted to delve into that a little bit. Basically, Tarisland gives you a few different options in terms of professions. It's not as varied as other games, there's basically 4 professions. There's Forge, Jewelry, Tailor, and Alchemist. However, within those professions are different builds and more customization that will either make you a gatherer, a refiner, or a processor of said profession. The game was recommending to me that I choose jewelry, because it was currently the lowest chosen profession, so it had the highest potential to make the most money. But I ended up choosing Forge, which of course comes along with mining. I found some copper ore out in Ancash Canyon because my profession quest directed me there. And actually, through refining the materials and completing that quest, I got myself to level 20, which meant that I could continue with the story. I disguised myself as a centaur and rescued some prisoners. I then saved this little guy on the beach and got myself to level 23. And not too long after that, the story quest finally concluded, saying that I had to reach level 26. But also, I still had 7 hours before the level cap and the story quest would be unlocked. So I figured now would be a good time to check out some of the other content. I completed the Camp Carlion dungeon, which got me to level 25. And then I participated in some battleground PvP. Basically, PvP currently is just a time investment. You gain certain currencies for participating, which can unlock certain rewards. The battleground maps cycle and change every day, and it's basically a game of Zerg domination. However, I definitely had fun, and it seems like the PvP is pretty balanced. But I'm not much of a PvPer, so maybe some more experienced players in the comments can tell you why it's not. Afterwards, I finished the Camp Carlion dungeon on Elite, and that got me to level 26. And then I decided I would wait till tomorrow to continue with the progression. That is, until I realized I could participate in a raid. The Shadow Witch raid on normal was available to level 26 characters. Sweet. Now, the raids in Tarisland are a little different than you might find in other games. There's really not much in terms of trash mobs. It seems to generally put you directly into the fight. There was a small amount of trash in the Shadow Witch raid, but the one that came out later on didn't have any trash. Shadow Witch was actually really fun. She had some devastating attacks, mechanics that required the entire group to work together. There was massive avoids. We actually wiped the first time because people were doing one of the mechanics wrong, where you had to step on these white circles on the ground. By the second time, we got it down, and I got this awesome epic axe. Probably best in slot at this point in time, so I was pretty happy. Now, I'll actually wait till tomorrow to continue questing. And at this point, I actually ended up taking a few days off to work on some other things, but when I returned, it was actually day 5, which meant the level cap was 36, and tomorrow we would finally hit the cap of 40, the actual max level. Through the story quest, I was introduced to a new zone known as the Misty Forest, and today I just flew through all of the levels. I learned about the gear inlay system, which acts like a gem or enchant system for weapons and armor. I participated in quite a few different dungeons, some of which were actually very difficult, especially on Elite. In this one particular case, I basically soloed the last boss with just 2 bots because the other 2 real players had no idea what was going on. And eventually, through probably 3 or 4 hours of gameplay, I once again hit the level cap of 36, and I was time gated until tomorrow when we could finally hit 40. The last day. That's level 39, just one more level to go. And to finish it off, I did Botanical Garden on Elite. This took 3 failed pugs, where either the tank or the healer left, until I finally found a group who could make it to the last boss. Let me tell you, this boss is no joke. It requires coordination, good movement, good placement, and it was a ton of fun. You could tell I was actually with a good group because I wasn't topping the DPS meter. But we got it down, and here we go. Okay, well, I completely missed getting to level 40. I turned on my recorder just a second too late, but we now unlocked a few different things. The new raid, arena, which sounds like it could definitely be a lot of fun, and also we unlocked something called Arcane Realms, which I'm not too sure what that is just yet. But I had to try the new raid on normal, so I went in with a team after waiting a while for the LFR queue to pop. He's basically a giant shark boss that has 1,000,000 HP. On normal mode, the mechanics were fairly forgiving, but I can imagine on Elite or Epic, this dude is probably fairly difficult. But if I'm being honest, folks, that's about it for me on Tarisland. At least for this video. What might appear from an outsider looking in as a sort of mobile gacha game with gimmicky Eastern-style mechanics and a massive amount of pay-to-win is just blatantly not true. Tarisland, like I said, is probably some of the most fun I've had with an MMO's release since Season of Discovery for Classic WoW. And anyone who knows me knows I loved Season of Discovery when that was released. Does Tarisland have its faults? Of course, and I'm going to get into those shortly before ending with why I think this game is actually really special and is honestly taking over. A ton of people are playing and enjoying Tarisland right now. It's actually quite popular, at least what I can tell from the MMO circles that I occupy. But let's talk about what could be done better. The world feels pretty small at the moment. If exploration and world traveling is important for you, as well as immersion, Tarisland definitely doesn't hit the same way as something like actual World of Warcraft, or an ESO, or a Guild Wars 2. The maps and zones are small, the cities are small, but that kind of makes sense for the game to also be available on mobile. Next, the game only allows you to change your appearance through cosmetic items, which definitely some of them can be rewarded through in-game challenges, but most are rewarded through the cash shop. I'm not personally a big fan of not being able to see my character's progression presented through the items that they're wearing. Next, the game has many turn-off sort of mechanics that might turn people away. For example, filling easier dungeons with bots, allowing auto-run after reputation grinds, over-the-top cosmetics on the shop. None of these I personally believe are actually super invasive to the core feel of the game, but I can understand how some people might dislike it. And the crafting is acceptable, but I'd definitely be open to expanding it later on. Obviously, I personally didn't get too deep into it, but only 4 professions seems a little lackluster. And to be honest, the 4 that are available just don't seem very primary. Like, sure, you have forge and tailory, but then the only other 2 are alchemy and jewelry? It just seems like a strange choice to me. And finally, the fact that due to it being a mobile game as well as a PC game, it will always need to cater to the lowest common denominator, which will be mobile gamers. Meaning that at times your camera might feel strange, certain user interfaces might not work. It's honestly not nearly as noticeable in Tarisland as I've seen with other PC or mobile games, but it's definitely still there. Now, let's talk about why I'm 100% going to keep playing Tarisland. First off, the combat feels completely awesome. There is a ton of customization within each class, having 2 specs. But even further than that, there are different talents within those specs. There is the Inscribed Stone talent tree, which I didn't even get into. And on top of all of that, it's super reactive and definitely fluid. It literally feels like playing World of Warcraft with less buttons. Secondly, the raids, the dungeons, the PvE content that the game thrusts you into immediately is actually challenging, actually fun, requires teamwork, skill, and communication. And the best part is, the leveling experience is so fast that if I wanted to make another character and try out actually difficult content with that character, you could basically get to the same point within a day or two. Next, I felt absolutely no pressure to spend any money on this game in any way, shape, or form. This is by far one of the most free mobile MMOs I've ever seen. Almost everything you can spend money on is cosmetic and optional and doesn't really affect the gameplay. That could change in the future, but right now this game is ridiculously free compared to other games in the modern MMO market. And finally, now this one's a little intangible, but it's just fun. It's an absolute blast. Beginning to end, I was excited to hop on. Hell, I'm excited to finish this video so I can hop on again. It's a genuinely fun game to play with goals to shoot for, collections to work towards, difficult content to attempt. It's just fun. You can PvP, PvE, make a new class, and do all of this super easily without having to put in too much time or commitment. I definitely recommend you guys at least give Tarisland a try, because I was so pleasantly surprised. Anyway, folks, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the video. Don't forget a like, a comment, a subscription. Those things help a bunch. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider becoming a channel member. Anyways, I'll catch you all in the next one. Later.